divorced or something, so they cannot be with any kind of men.
Wow.
Yeah, so if you want, I can send you this.
Yeah, I'd really like that. Everything sounds really sad, but very important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good way of summing it up. Sad, but very important.
It's so hard because you want to say, wow, that's so important. Wow, that's amazing. But then you're like, but not amazing, but terrible. Yeah. So,
That's English.
but yeah,
So I just, another student of mine just completed her PhD, and she worked on the relationship between mothers and daughters in the context of poverty, and how the ways in which these mothers supported their daughters in their aspiration to achieve higher education. And what is so fascinating about her work, I hope she comes here tonight. What is so fascinating about her work is that once she completed her PhD, she was able to go back to these households, find out what happened. And what happened was that for a third of the dyads, all the efforts for higher education went down the drain, and she found her interviewees, those who just a few years really wanted to manage, get a university degree. She found them married, with kids, with pregnancies, as if nothing was said, just in the old traditional path. But there was another category who were still struggling, and a third who were really managing. They managed to cross the boundary, and engage in higher education. Here she is. Sinyal, I'm just talking about your work. Sinyal?
Hi, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, or complete talking about
I was just describing how your long I forgot how you say this word, but anyway, how you came back to the families after a while, finding these three categories. So this is what I was describing. Yes.
Yeah.
Have you seen like Jess Hardy's work? She's coming out with a book called The Best Laid Plans, where she also does this with women. She goes back and tries to she studies aspirations and then tries to go find out what happened. I think it's so cool. It's so rare that people do that with interviews, and so good.
Right. Hi, Libby. Long time no see. Could you write her name in the chat?
Yeah.
Please, Jenifer?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I'm just going to take it.
Hi, Nirit.
Hi.
Hi.
Somebody's got their microphone on and we can hear a conversation.
But Ronnie or Rona, you can mute them. Rona?
כן, העברתי את האירוח
Anyone who disturbs us.
את יכולה להשתיק את כולם? פשוט העברתי לרוני את השרביט.
רוני ההוסט, בסדר.
Just hold on, how do I do it? I've never done it before.
בפרטיסיפנטס. את נכנסת לפרטיסיפנטס ויש לך אופציה כזאת. מיוט, את רואה?
Hold on a sec. Yeah. But then we can't hear this conversation that's going on.
מי שמדבר משחרר את עצמו מהמיוט.
אוקיי.
ואז זה בסדר.
And we can Am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yeah, you're unmuted. It's exactly 8:30 in Israel. Should we wait like 5 more minutes? Orly, Einat, Rona, what do you say? 3 more minutes?
2 or 3 minutes, I think it's okay.
Okay, so we'll wait 2-3 minutes and then we'll begin. In Israel, it's exactly the time for family and putting kids to sleep.
Right. Oh, yes. My 3-year-old right now goes to bed at 10 p.m. So I would probably, I don't know, she's just, it's impossible. So.
היי דליה, אני שמחה שאת כאן, את מרגישה טוב? דליה עכשיו מתמודדת עם קורונה. We're all after our COVID.
Yeah.
So Dalia here is facing it right now.
Yeah.
I think Ronnie, are you after? Is it behind you?
I'm still in the midst. I was saying before that I think this meeting has made me feel better, but I'm.
Oh, good.
I'm so sorry. Yeah.
And Michal Komem, it's so nice to see you here with us. Long time no see. Hi, Sari. I'm saying hi to those whom I would, הנה גם נור כאן, many people, ויעל, long time no see באמת, מה שלומך? Wow. Okay, I will stop with that. Hi, Narda.
No, it's also our opportunity to meet. It's part of the communal atmosphere. Okay, so I think I'll begin. I just want to make sure we're recording, we're collecting questions. I've written things for ourselves so that we don't start without making sure. So good evening, everybody. My name is Ronnie Eyal Lubling. Thank you all very much for joining us for this very special meeting, which is part of a collaboration between the family research community led by Professor Orly Binyamin, Dr. Einat Lavi and Rona Ziv Jorland, and the youth studies community led by Dr. Libby Be'er and myself. For those of you who are new, both communities operate under the Israeli Sociological Association, and if you aren't registered to one of them yet as a member, please write your name and the community you're interested in and we'll add you to the mailing list. We are honored, no less, to host Professor J'enifer Silva at our last meeting for this year. Professor Silva is assistant professor at the Paul O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University.
רוני, חכי רגע, גיא אומר שג'ניפר התנתקה.
אוי.
היא לא כאן.
נחכה לרגע?
נחכה, בטח נחזור.
כן.
איך שמת לב? כל הכבוד.
פתאום ראיתי את המסך של המשחיר ו...
דווקא לא הייתה שום בעיה, עד עכשיו היינו ביחד איזה רבע שעה, הכל היה בסדר.
נכון.
יש לך איזה קשר וואטסאפ איתה או משהו, רוני?
וואטסאפ, אבל אני כותבת לה רגע מהר במייל.
אני מאוד מקווה שאת המפגש הבא שלנו כבר לא נעשה בזום. ואז אף אחד לא יתנתק.
אבל אם זה לא יהיה בזום, עינתי, אז אנחנו לא נוכל אורחים מאמריקה.
למה? תעושים נושאים שמעתי, מאוד יפה.
אוקיי. אם יש המון כסף, כן, דרך לממן, כן.
כל עוד לא נתקעים בפקקים של השדה, אז מצליחים להגיע.
אני לא רואה אותה אצלי, שנייה.
היא לא חוזרת. יא חביבי. בינתיים אסתר, אני אומרת לך שלום ומה שלומך. אבל את על מיוט, אז את לא יכולה לענות לי.
אהלן אורלי,
היי.
מה שלומך?
בסדר, אני שמחה לראות אותך כאן איתנו.
תודה רבה, אני שמחה להיות איתכם פה ולראות את כל הנשים המעוניינות, המעורבות במחקר פמיניסטי, אני מניחה, זה כיף גדול.
במחקר פמיניסטי גם בלימודי צעירים וגם בלימודי משפחה.
נהדר, נהדר, יופי.
כן.
כן.
אבל ג'ניפר לא עולה, אולי בגלל המתחים הפוליטיים.
כן, אורלי עשתה לה הקדמה. רגע. הנה, אני רואה עכשיו שעוד מישהו הצטרף. אולי זאת היא.
היא עונה לך לאימייל?
עוד לא, לא. אולי משהו באינטרנט שם, אני לא יודעת, למרות שהכל היה סבבה לגמרי, לא...
כן, הכל היה סבבה עד שרצינו להתחיל, מדהים. היי, אבתיסאם.
היי, ערב טוב.
ערב טוב.
טוב.
אהלן אבתיסאם.
אהלן, מה שלומכם?
אנחנו דואגות כי האורחת שלנו התנתקה והיא לא מצליחה להתחבר מחדש.
אוקיי, אולי קצת סבלנות.
כן, זה הרכיב החסר.
כן, כן. אני מרגישה את זה, כן. לבעת המסך.
היי עדי.
הנה, רגע. הנה, היא כותבת, it's spinning and saying that it's connecting, I'm at work, so the internet should be excellent.
אוי. אני רק אומרת לכל המצטרפות שהאורחת שלנו התנתקה, והיא עכשיו אומרת לנו שהאינטרנט שלה צריך להיות מצוין, אבל זה לא קורה. אז אנחנו מחכות עוד כמה רגעים שהיא תחזור.
היי עדי.
So I had to decide.
Here you are. We were waiting for you.
I'm here, but I'm from my phone because like my work internet just won't connect. It keeps crashing.
Wow.
So I might have to do it. I might have to email my slides to someone.
Yeah.
Right. So email it to Ronnie because you have Ronnie's.
I'll do the introduction, email it to Rona, and she'll put it on while I'm okay.
To Rona.
Rona, can you see her?
Yeah, I'll write my email in the chat right now.
I can't believe it's so crazy. I'll try again. But then I get this like circle of death and it's like won't move.
Yeah.
It just keeps saying it's crashing. Okay.
Did you see the Rona's email address on the chat?
I did.
Okay.
I was just trying one last time.
So Ronnie, you can go on with the introduction and perhaps by then we're set.
I don't know what Jennifer heard. I'll just start from where I start talking about you. So we are honored, no less, to host Professor Jenifer Silva at our last meeting for this year. Professor Silva is assistant professor at the Paul O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Her research focuses on social class inequality, transitions to adulthood, family and intimate life, political culture, and qualitative research methods. Previously, Silva taught sociology at Bucknell University. She was also a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, where she studied the impact of economic insecurity and social isolation on the transition to adulthood for working class youth. Silva has authored 2 books exploring American working class culture, including We're Still Here, Pain and Politics in the Heart of America, and Coming Up Short, Working Class Adulthood in an Age of Uncertainty, both published by Oxford University Press. She's currently funded by the Russell Sage Foundation on a project that integrates women's electronic health records and in-depth interviews to uncover social determinants of health and barriers to well-being among women living in a disadvantaged rural community. Professor Silva's work has been very influential, to those of us studying young adulthood in the context of family and social marginality. A lot of the work written on the transition to young adulthood in the late modernity and on the ways this transition is experienced within family life has been mostly grounded in middle and upper class experiences and privileges, and has neglected a thorough examination of young adulthood and family life as it is experienced in the context of poverty and other types of marginalization. This is, of course, being a major critique on a lot of the research done on young adulthood in the last 2 decades, and one of the reasons why Professor Silva's work is so unique. Her analysis of the process of becoming young adults, while it focuses on the subjectivity of the self, it also maps out how the young adult self is constructed within a family context of traumatic experiences, a cultural context of psychological discourse of self-development, as well as a structural context of poverty and social inequality. I know that for me and for many of us here today, Professor Silva's work has been highly inspirational. So without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Jenifer Silva, and following her presentation, we shall open up for a discussion amongst us, and you're welcome to write questions as they arise in the chat, and we'll collect them and bring them up in the discussion later.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. I'm actually now on my cell phone, so I can't really do my slides, but I emailed them. So I don't know if we want to like pull them up anyway, and I can just, because I have a lot of quotes on them. So whatever works, or I can just kind of talk. I'm sorry, I have no idea what's going on. But anyway, yeah, so I'm honored. Yeah, we could pull them up and just share them. And I could at least.
I haven't get them yet. I'm refreshing my email and
I think there's something wrong with like my work, because it kept telling me internet was down. Which is funny because I purposely came into the office because it was better than my home internet. So I'm using like my cell, but anyway, maybe it'll come back soon. But anyway, so I'm a sociologist. It's nice to be among sociologists. I now work in a policy school, and most of my work is about how people experience and make sense of, and also envision solutions to social and economic inequality. And I'm very interested in hearing people's accounts of the world and trying to use those accounts to try to make sense of patterns we might see in demographic data. And so today I was going to talk a little bit about Coming Up Short, which was my first book. It was my dissertation. And the kind of demographic pattern or puzzle I was trying to figure out was that, yes, thank you so much. I actually have a slide on it, but this is just as wonderful. You know, I was really interested in this idea that traditional markers of adulthood had been increasingly delayed, you know, disorderly or reversible. Things like moving out of your parents' house, getting a job, finishing school, you know, having children within marriage. And so I was really interested in trying to understand what it meant to young adults to grow up today without these traditional markers. And so I kind of went out into the world and talked to 100 men and women who are both Black and white to talk to them about their transition to adulthood. And at this time especially, there was a lot of, you know, media talking about how entitled and lazy the millennial generation was. And so part of what I wanted to do was set the transition to adulthood in a context of, you know, disappearing blue collar jobs, insecure work, fragile families, and also shrinking institutions and increasing isolation from social institutions that maybe used to connect people together. And I will say, especially like for the people who are working on their dissertations, like the big questions were, you know, how do working class people, you know, define what it means to be an adult? And I really thought people were going to talk to me about like their anger about big banks, or their anger at, you know, government not providing a better safety net. But actually they didn't say that at all. And so I was kind of doing these interviews and hearing, and everyone just kept wanting to tell me about their families. And they just wanted to mostly tell me about experiences of pain and trauma that they'd experienced as young people. And I actually kind of had some moments of panic because I didn't understand like why they didn't want to answer any of my interview questions. They just kind of wanted to talk about the past. And so then I kind of, regrouped and said, okay, well, what I think this book is really about is that, working class young adulthood today is characterized by, people have very low expectations of loyalty at work. They expect to be unstable. They are nervous about any kind of romantic commitment because they feel like they've been betrayed so many times that it's risky. And I heard this widespread distrust of social institutions and kind of embracing self-reliance and embracing isolation, which was kind of the opposite that my, naive young self thought I would find. And then, this is where this work came in about the therapeutic narrative, where when I wanted to know what it meant to grow up, people didn't say, oh, I make enough money to support myself. They'd say, I had a very, abusive family, or I was in a bad relationship, or I had to struggle with addiction, but I learned how to heal myself. And so it was like this new, definition of adulthood where people are reconstructing a very difficult past and also reconstructing disappointments and what would look like as failures into an accomplishment and into an achievement. So this was, Eva Luz, and she had this, talked about a self endowed with the power to make or unmake itself. And that became kind of a big way of thinking about adulthood for me. But so to kind of, and also like if anyone wants to jump in, please do anytime. I now work with economists, so I'm used to having people yell. All the time. So what happened with my next work was I actually regretted not having talked to young people about their political beliefs, because I had heard this whole narrative of the self and I understood how they thought about self-reliance and betrayal, but I hadn't taken that next step to think about how their ideas might translate into political beliefs and behaviors. And so that led to my second book, which I'm going to talk more about today, which is more about how poor and working class Americans, mostly young, take these narratives of the self and then connect them to the political sphere. And so the puzzle that I'm able to use here is that in the United States, basically for decades, we've seen politicians abandon working class and poor people. But at the same time, the people who seem like they should mobilize and the people who, seem like they should be rising up together to fight are actually the least likely to act politically in what seems like their own self-interest. So American non-voters are generally poor and young and less educated and more racially and ethnically diverse. And so I kind of, part of me wanted to study why we've seen working class people become more right-wing, but I also wanted to study why we've seen working class people withdraw completely and not participate in politics at all. And trying to think about whether this new generation, millennials and maybe Gen Z, will they be like their parents in terms of politics, or might there be like a new kind of generational engagement? And so the way I approached this was to try to bring this idea of narrative into political science. So there's some interesting work that's come out that says that most voters are actually like very emotional, and they often will vote based on identity and kind of how someone like me should vote versus what they might think is actually in their economic self-interest. And so I kind of wanted to capture these, working class people's sense of who they are in the world, and try to figure out how they create these identities and then how they use these identities and connect it to their political identities. And so I decided to take this storytelling approach or narrative approach to politics, and sort of think about how people reconcile where their lives have turned out and how they see that as political or not. And so what I did was I spent several years in this collection of small communities in kind of the it's the Northeast, but it's a very rural area in Pennsylvania. And I spent a lot of time in this area that used to be very left wing because it was a coal mining community, and the miners it has this like, very rich history of strikes and unions, but in this area, this Democratic Party has been losing voters for a long time. And many of the white people have switched to be Republican. This was an area where there was a lot of support for Trump. And at the same time, what was really interesting in this space is that it had historically been an overwhelmingly white space. But in the last 10 years or so, it's become more racially diverse because Black and Hispanic people have been moving from cities into this rural space because it is much less expensive to live there and also safer than where they were coming from. And so to me, this area was so interesting because it was showing how workers have been shifting right or stopping voting altogether, but also have captured a lot of racial tension. And it seemed like a place where I might be able to connect narrative to politics and also think about how young people might be different than their parents. And so in terms of my study, I was like a newcomer in the area. So I had to spend a lot of time going to like church and festivals and town meetings and drug addiction support groups. And I went to volunteer fire companies and football games, and then tried to get to know people and tell them about my story and what I wanted to figure out. And it took a while, but I think a few people started feeling bad for me and, finally started introducing me around and taking me places. And then I was able to conduct 108 interviews of white, Black, and Hispanic people, and 2/3 were under 40. So it's a mostly young sample. And I really, as usual, which I did with Coming Up Short, I felt like I asked a lot of questions I thought would be important about how people thought about politicians. And then the interviewees themselves took over the process, and they told me what they thought was important. And I kind of listened to that. And so just to tell you a little bit about it, and this actually does relate back to the family. So what I found was that the people I spoke to, most of them were extremely critical of economic inequality, extremely distrustful of politicians who they thought had failed to protect workers. But one of the things that had happened to them is that their distrust in institutions was so strong that there was no institution that was mediating between their personal suffering and pain and any kind of collective struggle. And so they really were cultivating these individual stories and strategies for coming to terms with why their lives were difficult. And so they actually, like in Coming Up Short, wanted to tell me about these stories of triumphing over pain. And they actually use these stories of triumphing over pain to talk about politics too. And they use these stories of triumphing over pain to draw these very stark moral boundaries between who deserves help politically and who doesn't. And what I kind of found was that, people are finding meaning in stories of overcoming suffering alone, and also in conspiracy theory and self-help. And all of their coping strategies, with the exception of a few, were very solitary, and they were strategies that would really turn them kind of inward. Oh, sorry. And so I was gonna just bring in a few stories of the people I met and kind of think about how this narrative works.
Just a minute, Jennifer, just a minute.
Yeah.
Just a minute.
רונה, you're the
רונה, את יכולה לעשות מיוט פה לכרמית הזו? הנה, היא על מיוט. You may I think you should continue. It's okay now.
Just release the microphone, Jennifer.
Jennifer, please.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So so basically what I kind of find is that coming to terms with pain and convincing themselves that transcending this pain promises a moral reward to them actually does a lot of work for organizing their stories of the self and organizing their politics. So I'm going to talk about a few people that I met, and these are often very disturbing, but I think maybe we could then all talk together and talk about kind of how it also relates to family. So I'm going to start with Roger, and kind of the slide I had for Roger was called, betrayed and abandoned. So Roger's 42-year-old white man, and he's married to Brenda, who's 41. And they both are living in this constant pain. So they've been trying for a long time to get medical assistance from the government for depression and diabetes, congestive heart failure, and obesity, but they haven't been successful at this. And so Roger has been out of work since 2009, and he tells me that he spends his days lying on his recliner. He has this like orange pharmacy bottle on the shelf above his head. And there's this doctor in town who was actually infamous for prescribing opiate painkillers. He actually later was arrested and he went to prison. But he tells me like, oh, if I have a cyst on my body or, a sore on my body, the doctor will like, look at me for 5 minutes and give me a script for, opiates. And he says like, sometimes he doesn't even have to go and he can refill his script. And so I talked to him about politics. He tells me he's a registered Democrat, and he's a Democrat because of loyalty for his father. He says, his dad was a coal miner and his dad collected checks from the government. And Roger says he actually voted for Barack Obama, but then he quit. And he says, my dad was a Democrat. I'm going to stay Democrat for him, but I'll never vote Democrat again. They used to help our family. They really did. I mean, I think I could have gotten back to work with my health. He says, I wrote Donald Trump a letter. If you get my health back, I'll go vote for you. I'll go work for you. I'll go beyond your personal security. Just try to make me some kind of bionic man. And so, and I ask him, is the American dream alive? And he says, it's dying. I really think it's dying. He says, for the refugees, maybe it's alive, but for anybody here, it's dying. And then he tells me a race war is coming. He says, it will be Black against white, Hispanic against white, and we'll fight it out in the streets. And he says, maybe God made me disabled just so I can't go out into the world and shoot people. And he says, the government needs a totally new overhaul. He says, clear everybody out, put them all down there and put a bomb on them. And he says, I very rarely trust anyone because every time I start trusting someone, something happened. He says, Stone Cold Steve Austin said it on wrestling, and he put it in 3 letters, DTA, don't trust anyone. And so for Roger, this man, it's like his political views pits like employment and healthcare for him. He believes he's someone who belongs against people he thinks of as undeserving. And he says, he asks me at the end if I've ever played any video games like Fallout or Fallen Earth or Stalker, which I haven't. But he says, I think all those games like on Xbox, he says, you see how it looks like a wasteland? That's how America is going to look real soon. It's going to be a civil war and it's going to be nasty. And so he's kind of imagining these scenes of, protecting America from becoming this wasteland. And so this was very often the case with the white men I spoke to. Whereas for the women I spoke to, what I heard more of was how narratives of pain and trauma within their family would be linked to this larger political arena where you can't trust anyone. And a lot of women actually told me that they had embraced suffering as this means for self-growth. And basically saying like, if we put our, faith in a politician, that would just be stupid because, everyone has betrayed me and I can't do that again. And so to tell the story of Shelley, she's a 33-year-old white woman. She's the granddaughter of a coal miner as well. And she grew up with, she told me a story of growing up in a trailer park. She said her stepfather was an angry truck driver who sexually abused her when she was young. And she tells me how when she was 18, she quickly married a boy from high school who was enlisting in the army so she could move away and cut off contact from her parents. And she said 6 years later, she got a phone call that her mom had died. And she says to me, my mom's friend said, your mom used to sit all day long waiting. As soon as her cell phone would go dead, she'd freak out because she'd say, Shelley was going to call me one day. And so Shelley pauses, she takes a long drag of her Newport cigarette and she says, but I never called. I never called. And that's when I spiraled into my addiction. That's when I didn't care anymore. That's when life said, we're going to catch up with you. Now you're going to punish yourself, she said. And I ripped my whole life apart because I didn't know how to cope with what I did. And she says it wasn't until her daughter saw her crawling up the steps high on heroin that she sweated. She said, I started sweating and shaking and puking and crying until she had detoxed herself. and then she got divorced. And she says, now I could probably get disability. I have PTSD. I have anxiety. I could probably be on all kinds of medication. So this is where it gets really interesting. So I asked her about how she thinks about life. And so she says to me, she says, there's a doctor on YouTube, and he was talking about how he'd seen a magazine, and the article was called How Do Lobsters Grow? And it says that lobsters are soft, mushy creatures that live inside a tough, rigid shell. And what happens when the lobster starts to grow, the shell doesn't expand, the lobster does. So the lobster starts to swell and starts to feel uncomfortable. So he grows a little bit, produces a new shell, goes out into the world and deals with life. The doctor says if lobsters had doctors, they'd never grow, because the moment the lobster would start to feel uncomfortable, the lobster would go to the doctor. They'd prescribe it this, prescribe it that, and the lobster would never experience what true growth is. So if the trigger for growth in a lobster is feeling uncomfortable, what's the difference between people? You take these kids out of stressful situations, if you medicate them and you put them in little bubbles and you don't learn how to deal with misfirings and mishaps, then you don't naturally learn how to cope and deal with the things that are happening. She says, avoiding pain actually just leaves you vulnerable and unprepared for trauma. She says, and then people blame society. Why? She says, you need to be stressed out. I'm a recovering addict, a heroin addict. I didn't take medicine to get off the drug. I didn't take anything to get off the drug. I just sat my happy little ass in that bedroom and I sweated it out and I suffered it out. I stressed it out because I never want to feel that way again. The best system for growth in life is stress. So, from this worldview, if we go from the personal to the political, for her, suffering is a way to turn opportunity into growth. And she thinks that avoiding pain or blaming other people for your problems is actually just going to make you worse in the end. And so she says she actually abstains from voting. She says all of her family have been Democrats for many generations. But she says, my family is so fucked up on drugs. They live off the state. I don't want my hands anywhere near that shit show. And she kind of she just says, I don't want to have anything to do with this, help. And she tells me she's more worried about survival than the shit show of politics. And then she says, am I going to put my life or my child's life in the hands of somebody that can't keep their story straight? I'm not. And I'm not going to put my life or my child's life in the hands of somebody that uses that much orange spray tan. And then, she says, like another woman told me, putting your faith in one person, a politician, is a lot because people have really messed with my trust. Like one of my biggest pet peeves is saying you're going to do something and you don't do it, because so many people have done that to me in my life. And so then it's like, they take these experiences of their personal life and treat it as if this is how the world is. And in that way, they actually, of course, disable themselves politically in a way that I think may have real consequences for them later. And so I also wanted to talk about
Jennifer, before you continue, perhaps I can just ask you to,
sure,
if you could contextualize what you just said with Orschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, because it's so similar. They're coming from such different background. These are traditionally Republicans, these are traditionally Democrats, but at the moment they are just in the same place of just praising distrust as the major political step forward in both stories.
I think it's true, but in the same way, I think that their story of distrust is very different. I think in Arlie Hochschild's work, she's in a place in Louisiana where people are white and they, I don't think they're as poor or working class as the people I spoke to. And they also have very strong ideological views. So they have very strong opinions about how we have to protect capitalism. And they had very strong opinions about how the government should stay out of the economy and how, we have to sacrifice the environment in order to protect capitalism. And this is not the level of discussion that I had with the kind of poor and working class young people that I spoke with. They were actually extremely critical of capitalism, as I'll get to in a little bit. They thought about politicians and corporations as bullies. They were willing to call out unfairness, and it was more that the distrust came from their own everyday experiences and was more of an adaptive response where counting on people actually had hurt them in the end. I wouldn't say that it was like an ideological system about politics so much as it was about like connecting their own lives. And I think part of that might be that Arlie's respondents were very connected to each other and they actually engaged in politics, whereas the people I spoke to are really, as Shelley says, concerned with getting through the day and living and don't see that as political at all. So those are some thoughts, but I'll keep thinking about that. So one of the things, I'm going to talk about Adrian now, who is a 24-year-old Black man. And so one of the things is that the people I spoke with were convinced that everything is about money. And in a way, like they're quite radical, where they're thinking that, politicians have been bought off by corporations and no one cares about their interests. And so Adrian, this 24-year-old Black man, he had moved to this rural area and from New York. Sorry, is there a chat question? I don't know if I can see it from my phone. About what is happening? Oh, for discussion, okay. That's a good question. I can talk about that too later from different research though. So yeah, so he moves to this central Pennsylvania kind of rural, very white area. And he says he was actually really excited to move because he thought he would have some opportunity in his life. He thought the schools would be better and he was excited to live in a place where he couldn't hear gunshots all the time. But then he tells me, I got suspended my first day in school. He said it was my first time ever getting in trouble in school because I used to love school. And then I got suspended because I liked rapping and I had a rap book and I'd write my raps in it. And I guess I took it to school one day and I put it in my locker and it fell out and somebody found it, took it to the principal and said they felt threatened by me. And I was like, what do you mean you felt threatened by me? It's just a piece of paper. And then he says he's just constantly harassed by the local police. So he says, the cops came to school one day. They said we fit the description of an old woman being robbing the old lady's purse. It was very confusing. And they said, I said, okay, well, what time did it happen? And they said the time. And he said, but I was in school then. And they said, well, you still fit the description. And he says, well, how did I do a robbery if I was in school? And so then he drops out of school because he says, they just stopped me and harassed me for no reason. And at that point, he starts stealing cars. He's buying and selling marijuana. He's going on joy rides late at night. And then he actually ends up selling crack, cocaine for a little bit. And actually, eventually he found a legal job and he was happy and he stopped selling drugs. But he says, unfortunately, he says, before I had stopped selling, I had actually already sold to an undercover police officer. And so basically, as soon as the person the undercover caught him, they locked him up and he got a felony. So I actually met him like 2 days after he'd come out of jail. And so he had just gotten out of jail and the Clinton-Trump election is just a week away. But he says it means nothing to him. He's like, I'm not an idiot. I know I'd rather have Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. But he refuses to vote because he doesn't believe that anybody would ever care about him. He says, either way, I grew up poor, I'm still poor. Nothing will change for me. They're going to make it better for rich people. They're going to make it harder for poor people. And he says that the American dream and all of our institutions have been corrupted to such an extent that he thinks like fairness or justice or opportunity it's just fantasy. So he says everything's about money. American dream, with no racism or people not judging you, that's people living in a fantasy world. If you have money, people judge you based on money. They look at you different depending if you got money or not. You got money, you do whatever you want. You kill somebody, you beat the charge if you have money. And then he actually goes further, which is another thing I didn't really anticipate, which is he summons up these conspiracy theories and he talks about the government actually trying to control the population. So he says, I think the government is a new world order. I think the government really is going to kill people off to control the population. I think they really are going to do that. If you control the population, you control everything going on. He says, I think there's going to be more government issued officers than regular people so they can control us. And so he kind of goes from his individual experiences and then he goes all the way to the government as this secretly murderous force. And he kind of disengages completely. And interestingly, like when I did these interviews, like the only time I heard a lot of excitement about politics was when people were able to talk to me about conspiracy theories. And then they'd get really excited because they wanted to sort of prove that they hadn't been fooled by this illusion that voting mattered. At one point, I was actually there in the area on the day of the election, and I was wearing a little sticker that said I voted that you get. And people were like, you don't really think your vote matters. And, you know, told me to take off my sticker because it was embarrassing that I would wear it. And so when this also relates back to coming up short, which is to say that kind of the only source of future like hope or momentum often came from, you know, protecting children or basically. So there was one woman I talked to named Tiffany, and she was a Puerto Rican woman. And, you know, she had described this really difficult time growing up where she had to fight and sell drugs to survive. She talked about going to prison after the birth of her child and having to kind of sacrifice her own dreams to help take care of her sister's children. And she says, but now, you know, I've moved here. Nobody knows me, thank God. So she says moving away from her home and moving away from her family is like how she protects herself. And she says she feels good only when she's with her children. She says, I always was trusting everyone and I always got fucked, always. Family too. My mom was like, why are you far away? And she says, I just need to be by myself. Sure, I get stressed out, I cry, but at the end of the day, I'd rather be by myself. I know I'm not going to hurt myself. And why would I want to be around people that hurt me? You know what I mean? Like, I know I won't do to myself, and I know my kids won't hurt me. So I stay far away. I'm saving myself. So I have no family. I have no friends. I don't care. I got my kids and they can be my best friends. And one of the questions I would ask is like, do you have a political hero or a person? And she's like, hero, myself. I'm my own hero. What I've been through, even stuff I haven't told you yet. There's stuff like rape and beating and prison. It's crazy. So I feel like I'm my own hero. But she says, my kids and they're good. You know, we don't have nobody. It's just us. They look up at me. We only have each other. And I'm like, do you have hope for the future? She's like, for me, no. She thinks my kids will be all right. And I'm like, okay, well, do you engage politically? And she's like, no, I would never know where to vote. She's like, I don't know where the paper is. Maybe I could ask someone. But she just laughs at me, this idea that, you know, we'd actually engage in anything political at this point. And so trying to like think about like what to take from these vignettes. I think what struck me was what united all of the different groups and the people I talked to was that they're all inwardly turned. They're all very focused on like self-protection, on enduring pain, and also on kind of personal redemption. And there was very little collective or external strategies for linking people up to politics. And instead, I almost felt like people would invalidate the suffering of others and say, oh, other people aren't working hard enough to survive. You know, I'm strong because I don't need other people. And these other people are undeserving and taking advantage of the government. I heard a lot of stories about, you know, people misusing welfare and how they didn't, you know, work hard enough and didn't suffer enough. And in some ways, like this pain that is in Coming Up Short and also in this newer book, it's like pain is the test of willpower. And so like they forge this identity as someone who has survived it on their own. And, you know, there's a historian named Keith Welu who argues that managing pain is like, we could see it as this fraught political exercise where it's like we wage it over the question of whose pain is valid and who deserves government intervention versus whose pain isn't valid and is fraudulent, who isn't deserving of any kind of public help. And I think that's happening here where individual pain management is like this necessity because, you know, their family and community ties are fragile, trust is non-existent, social safety nets are very limited, and their opportunities for mobility are very scarce. And so, you know, trying to figure out what to do with that, I think there is a very strong case to be made for reducing material scarcity and discrimination, but also thinking about like, how do you pull people back into relationships and communities, or, you know, how do you support people in a way that's not material, but also addressing disconnection and distrust. And this was like a hard question for me. So I was trying to read other people's work about this, or trying to think about, could pain be a vehicle for collective mobilization? There was one book by Jenifer Randles, who's a sociologist who studied marriage education programs. And she found that these couples who went to these marriage education programs, their marriages didn't get better, but they actually really enjoyed talking to each other about their distressing economic and family circumstances and connecting, and kind of realized like, oh, it's not just me, it's all of us. And there was another book by Joan Mazalis who talked about, poor people joining a welfare rights union were able to like create these kinds of networks and help each other. In the coal region where I studied I didn't see very much of this. People seemed to be on their own. And interestingly, like one of the only places I saw it was in these family support groups for drug addiction, where people would come and talk about their struggles with like a child or spouse who was addicted to opioids. And this was one of the only places I saw people come from different backgrounds and actually talk to each other and share information about resources and talk about how what was happening wasn't really working. But it was really hard to find other spaces where that was happening. And so it's like, for me, I'm like, okay, well, it seems like it would have to be some kind of local network that would be able to help people connect pain and inequality to actual politics. But I don't know exactly how that works. So I'll just, I'll wrap up there so we can all talk. Thank you. I'm sorry if my internet failed at work. I don't know why, but I did have really nice slides. So someone can look at them if they want to. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jenifer. This has been very, very interesting. I want to read out two of the questions that have come up from from some of the people here. So Shmuel, I hope I'm reading it correctly, and if not, please correct me. Shmuel wants to know, according to your opinion, what were the impacts of COVID-19 on the relations between young people and their family? Like, in what way has the pandemic changed the place of family in the life of youth and young people?
That's interesting. I was trying to think of what I was doing. So I was interviewing women of color in this area during that time over Zoom. And I was actually just talking to them about their health challenges. And I also did this other study with Brookings where I was talking to people during COVID. I don't know. I felt like in some ways there was some optimism during COVID because people had some government support and money. And also I think some of the women felt like they didn't have to somehow manage to do everything at home and like go to work. And like some women almost saw it as like a break because they got to like not have to get their kids ready and drop them off at school and then do everything, whereas they were all kind of home. And so at least in the beginning of the pandemic, there did seem to be like a little bit more, like everyone was taking a deep breath because they had a little more time, and they also had some government help, which they didn't usually have. But I don't know like how it actually turned out for them, because that was about a year ago. Because right now they won't have been getting any help anymore, and I'm not sure what will happen. I know that in terms of healthcare, the women I talked to, low income, mostly Hispanic and Black women all last summer, and I know that they felt like the health system was very hostile to them, and that they tended to be treated as kind of unfit mothers, and didn't feel like they were ever believed when they had health problems. So I definitely saw how the health system seemed to be another institution that made them feel distressful and also reluctant to get vaccinated as well.
Thank you. Einat, do you wanna ask your question?
Yeah, I can just repeat it. I just worried that I will forget what I wanted to say, but I can definitely just say it. So you are talking about these women and their stories, what they told you and what they didn't tell you, but their life experience remind me the stories of women who live in poverty in Israel. And particularly the main issue of trust. They don't trust anyone. And as you said, I think it was the Roger story. He said, don't trust, right? Don't trust.
DTA. Yeah, don't trust anybody. Yeah.
And also, so, but your women, so they said that they laughed about you, that you vote, right? That you voted, and they will not go to vote because they think that nothing will ever change for them. And also in Israel, nothing really changes for them. They are, in the same position, usually for ages, but they still go to vote. They have very strong political views, and they know what they are going to vote, and they are protesting, sometimes, and they're, right-wing voters, but they still don't trust the system. So I'm just wondering, because the issue of trust is so similar, here in the American context and also in Israel, they don't trust the system, but here they still vote, and they are very strong opinion about the political system. And in the US, you describe something very different. So I wonder what you think can be, the mechanism for that, or why is it?
I know, it seemed to me when I spoke with these women, it didn't seem like there was any way to link their stories to political action, like through any kind of institution that they trusted. So like, it wouldn't be through school, or it wouldn't be through, it seems like, things like police or healthcare or school were all such, they saw them as so corrupt, churches as well, that it seemed like if you don't believe in any of those like mediating groups, then they wouldn't make it as far as voting itself. So I don't know. And maybe they also had more social pressure that saw voting as kind of like a fantasy world versus something you had to do. And this is really class-based, of course. So instead of like feeling guilty if you don't vote, they felt like ridiculous if they did. I don't know though. I guess I should ask you what the mechanisms are in Israel that would link women up to politics.
Yes, this will require, a brand new lecture. So maybe we will have, we need to set another time just to discuss this one.
Yeah.
Wanted to ask a question?
Yes, I'd like to. Perhaps my question is somewhat related to a nut issue, and perhaps I can suggest a local mechanism that a nut actually found in her research in raising trust. And what a nut tells us is that social workers in this country, they undertake the maintenance of trust among the applicants to be one of the major outcomes, something substantial that they can achieve. They cannot achieve change in the material circumstances of the applicants. They cannot provide anything, but they undertake to maintain trust. And I think you should certainly continue to the conversation between the two of you over the notion of trust. But what I wanted to say is that your findings are very bad news for Mario Small, because what Mario Small taught us is that there would be some unanticipated gains, right? That people living in poverty would encounter some assistance in their neighborhoods, in various institutions in the neighborhood that would avail for them, make accessible for them their organizational network, something that would work for them. They would direct them to find some support of some kind, even if they don't have the right healthcare insurance. They will find some healthcare help through this organizational network. And what you're telling us is that what I felt since long, and that is that these unanticipated gains, they are so minimal, they are so marginal in people's lives, and they fail to take an active approach to actually get to those who needs the help, and they perhaps are there for those who would take the minimal trust that is needed in order to go search for some support. But it doesn't work in the other direction, and that is the sad news. And I think it would be a very important discussion for you to correspond with Mario Small with your findings.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Yeah, and I really did look for it. I looked for these situations, but I had a hard time finding spaces other than the addiction support groups. And I'm trying to think of any others, not really, that I would find. And I wanted to also talk about the social worker question. My latest project is a very cool project where I have been interviewing these poor women about their health and health experiences, and then working with a health system epidemiologist who is then able to read what like social workers and doctors write about the women in their health records. And one of the things that's been interesting is how women often feel like social workers are judging them, and that there's a lot of stigma for being unmarried and low income. And even something like a question of a social worker, such as, it's very hot, do you have air conditioning? The woman will say, she was judging me as this welfare mom, thinking I was unfit with my child because I don't have air conditioning. But the notes of the social worker will seem very neutral or empathetic. But there's like such a breakdown where women end up feeling judged and almost are so afraid that their children could be taken away, or they couldn't go home to their children, that they then kind of seem to pull back and actually end up maybe using less healthcare too. So I think that sounds like a really interesting and important difference in terms of the role of the social workers.
I want to, if I could just relate to that before the next question.
Yeah.
Nitzan, just hold on a sec, because Guy was waiting to ask a question.
Oh.
And then Noor, and then you, Nitzan, okay? I'm sorry that I have to...
Okay, thanks. Thank you for this very interesting talk, and for all your interesting works. And I think the issue of distrust is very interesting, and your finding actually remind me of the work Daniel Monteresco was doing about young Arabs in Jaffa, where he talked about a shadowed community. And I think that's one of the things you point out. There is no community when you compare the Orly Hochschild after Orly's remark to your findings. But I wanted to ask you about Trump, because you began with saying that the area is Trump supporting area, but then the people you discussed were apolitical in a way. Now, and the reaction is actually quite rational. I mean, their parents were Democrat. The Democratic Party stopped representing these kind of people a long time ago, ever since Clinton, or even before. So they don't trust Democrats. But what does Trump offer? That's a really interesting. What Trump has to offer to them. That's very interesting. Question.
It was really interesting. Where the older people I spoke with were the people who like Trump, and they liked Trump even in like early 2015, so very early on. They liked Trump and they liked Bernie Sanders, and they kind of liked them equally, because they thought Bernie Sanders had a good heart, and they liked that Trump would say anything to anyone and didn't seem like he'd been bought off by the normal politicians. And so then they eventually did like this idea of, I think it was mostly like this idea that Trump would stand up to the politics as usual and maybe get rid of the corruption and, bring back jobs to But the young people didn't believe that at all. They thought it was, they were like, this is ridiculous. Why are you thinking anyone really cares? Like they might think Trump was funny, but they didn't think that. They thought, of course, no one's going to really help us and no one's going to make anything change. And, they'd say, the US is a bully. Like, why am I even like, what would I be patriotic about? No one's going to help me. It's always going to be about politicians being out for themselves and corporations. So I do actually think you're right that they were kind of savvy and rational, but then they don't do anything. I mean, I was out of the fieldwork by 2019, but it seems to me like there has been some local political action since I've left in terms of Black Lives Matter but I don't know exactly what has happened since. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Did we freeze?
Noor?
No.
Yes, hi.
Okay.
Thank you for your talk. It was amazing. I haven't had the time to read your books, but I will do it. And I wanted to ask about citizenship, because a lot of the time.
It's okay. I can just give you a summary.
No, it's okay. I will read it. A lot of the time when we talk about being a citizen, we're talking about like going to vote. And I feel, okay.
She's here.
She's here. Okay. I thought like okay. So
I'm sorry, I was muted. I'm sorry.
Okay. And while you were sharing the amazing and painful stories, I thought about like all these institutions that they meet on the way, and they learn how to be a citizen. Because one of the things, like when you passing I-18, you're going to vote. That's the main thing, like being a citizen. And I thought about like all these institutions, just they don't believe them. So I wanna like they don't believe them. They don't trust them. Like where or how you see those places that they learn how to be a citizen. And because I think it's one of the most important thing in being young adults, like and to take in and to practice your agency and your ability to do something around you in the community for yourself. But schools, families, social worker, everywhere what they learn, I don't know where they learn how to be citizens. So if you can address this, or thank you, sorry.
No, I think it's a brilliant way of putting it. I don't know where they learn to be a citizen. I think they maybe figure out, I mean, I think part of it is that I don't even know if they feel like a citizen. I don't know if they feel like that sense of belonging. I think it's more of a lot of them feel alienated or disconnected, or maybe don't think of it as at all, because it doesn't seem like a meaningful identity. I mean, some people would say like, yeah, our schools never taught us anything about, civic education. But I think it's like much deeper than that, where they just feel such a strong kind of individualism because they feel like they have to. And that I think becoming part of a group seems very dangerous to them in terms of like what will happen to them. So yeah, I don't know where either. That's what I will say. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Nitzan?
Yeah, it's not actually really, I don't think I have a question. It was more related to what was said earlier about the healthcare and social workers. And I feel like it could, I thought a lot about the conspiracy theories, because it kind of I felt like they kind of went off track there. And
me too.
So,
me too.
So working in the healthcare and as a social worker, I feel like those would be moments where we start to think maybe they're psychotic or something happened there. And I feel like these extreme life experiences kind of led to a point where they have these conspiracy theories and they could come off as unhealthy there. And then maybe one of the things would be talking about the way poverty and these extreme life experience kind of shift the way you believe in things and think about things and feel things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's interesting because I think I thought that too. Like, oh, I have like suddenly started interviewing a crazy person. And the people I'd be interviewing would watch my face and they'd be like, you don't believe me? You're thinking me? You're judging me? And then I'd be like, but like at some point, like when you keep hearing it, it's kind of like, oh no, like this is not just like one-off. It seems like to be a kind of shared idea, especially among young men who, you know, rely mostly on their smartphones and social media to think about their ideas about politics versus talking to each other. And it's very easy to go down a rabbit hole. And also conspiracies do happen. And I think we all believe in them to some degree, but I think the degree to which you believe in them, if you're not having anyone check you, I don't know, for them, it was like one thing, you know, if they'd say, you know, September 11th, 9/11 was all about, you know, was all about money. It was all about oil. And you're like, and they just kind of like go with that. And they say it's all, everyone's a bully and everything's about money. And then all of a sudden it never happened or it was made up. So it's like that line where maybe they go further than we would. But because there's no like place where that would stop them. They're kind of on their own.
And we need
feel
to have,
smart.
Yeah, we need to have meaning to our experiences and to our life. And then they kind of pour in their own meaning or through social media. But and I also feel that maybe groups would help with that. But in my experience in practice, then it was very hard to form a group because these are people who wouldn't easily engage.
Right. Yeah. Because it probably doesn't always end well for them.
Sorry to jump in, but I feel a little bit that you go into a zone of epistemic injustice because you take in what they say and just replicating whatever happened to them in the past and not believing them. Yeah, but it's kind of like saying like, okay, they are in a zone that maybe we need a psychiatrist that would see them. Maybe it's from a care or something that it's really important, but still it's the same of like saying what they know and what they understand. It's again not okay.
Sure.
And I think especially for social workers, doctors, and everybody that will meet people in disadvantaged situation should be aware of all these stigmas and all these things that we think about people in those places, and immediately our knowledge about them just reducing what they feel and what they know. Sorry for
yeah, totally right. It's starting to say, oh, okay, well, why does this make sense to you? And from their point of view, I'm the crazy one because I think what I'm doing matters and I have a voice. And I think there's lots of evidence that I don't, you know, there's lots of evidence that politicians respond to the very wealthy people and no one else. So yeah, you can like reverse it and be like, actually, I'm the one who's deluded here, not them. Anyone?
Is there anyone else that would like
to? Adi had a question about violence.
Sorry.
Yes, and I'm not sure you will hear me properly because
we do.
So I wanted to ask, I mean, we hear the very alarming news from the US and all these mass shootings in schools. The last one was terrible. And it's all by young people. And they repeat the same stories that you told us that they told you about, you know, the great replacement theory and QAnon and incels and all these subcultures of young, poor, detached people. So I'm wondering if you had any accounts of violence narrated to you, and also if you have any explanations about this pandemic of violence among especially young white men in the US.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is also kind of not addressing your question, but one of the major conspiracies that people brought up was that these school shootings didn't happen, so that they were actually like Sandy Hook, which was one of the first ones. Like one of it was that it was all staged, and these are just like other ways of controlling people. And so I don't really know why or what that accomplished for people, but that's something I guess that to kind of think about. But yeah, in some ways, I don't know. The people I talk to, I don't know. I never really saw them as actually violent. I saw them as sort of like level-headed and rational in their own way, in the sense that they kind of understood like what systems were not working for them, and they were kind of trying to survive anyway, whatever way they could. So I don't really have it's like not my expertise to talk about more than that. So.
Indiana?
Okay, hi. I've also interviewed the women and adolescent Palestinian girls who are living in poverty in the Palestinian society here in Israel. I asked more about marriage, education, and bedwork. I didn't ask specifically or particularly about the political issues, but although they talk more about they don't trust the institution, or more they were specific about family, society, schools. They didn't mention an institution or political institution of the city, of the state, for example. Do you think it's also about an issue about preferences, that they are choosing their struggle? For example, in my interviews, they use the term education as weapon, and many of people who read my research, they think that the use of the term weapon it has a political context, but it's not. It's a weapon to secure their uncertain future financially. So do you think it's sort of how what you choose your struggle? Is it a social or political?
I don't know. Could you ask me again? I'm not totally sure about the.
Okay, I'll make it short now.
Yeah.
Do you think, my question is this the matter of the preferences, that they are not participate in the political life because are they struggling their daily life survival or survival?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because many of their parents had sort of more active political participation, so they kind of grew up like watching parents vote or watching family be kind of, members of unions or going to church. And they almost had some of them were kind of nostalgic, like, oh, my parents had an old car and we had to like tape the window on, but we were happy. And now it was like, and they kind of told the story of becoming more aware and disillusioned that that world doesn't exist anymore, or maybe it never did. So it's kind of like a freely letting go of like expectations of being political in a way that maybe they were raised with as who they are. I don't know if that speaks to preferences or how they tell their story. Yeah.
Has anyone else got a comment, question?
I just wanted to go back and state a very important difference between this population in this current study of yours and the population of coming up short. Because in coming up short, these were people who had some hope. I mean, they were going through higher education, even if only partially. They were having plans, or perhaps it's because they were a little bit younger. But here what we see is people that are really distressed, really oppressed by extreme poverty, extreme neglect, extreme alienation. It's like real bad stories of everything we know about poverty in the United States. I seem to remember a book that I forgot its name that suggests that it's important to think of poverty as a state to which you enter and then you're coming out of. And I will remember its name if you'll ask me later. But the point is that here with this population that you approached now, it doesn't seem to be the story. It's not the case. These people are they're shouldering the full price for the American neoliberal social policy, and there really isn't a source of light in their life. It's so desperate, and it's a very, very sad story. Like someone just said, a heartbreaking sociology. Because I don't know, it's not only that they do not have hope, I don't have hope. And that is what is really sad in this field that you chose now. You're on mute. While you're still struggling to unmute yourself, I will add that Shira Ofer, who is another sociologist in our department, and in collaboration with some of the people here, she writes recently on a relationship that become a burden, the relationship that become difficult to carry. Jenifer, are you still around?
I'm here. Yeah.
And so what comes up from your story is exactly that these people have to get rid of their parents, have to get rid of their homes in order to get some oxygen. And that's exactly her point at the moment. What is it that we need to do in order to get rid of those relationships that become sources of violence and oppression in our lives?
We can't hear you, Jenifer.
You're on mute again.
Now it tells me my video will stop, but I'm off mute. It thinks I'm driving my phone. But anyway, yeah, this idea also that so many places in America have these like left behind, the industry is gone and people like are just kind of hopeless, but also maybe would not be people who would support like a universal basic income. So it's hard to figure out like, how to appeal to them or how to restore hope.
Jenifer, there is a really interesting question here. We were talking about the ways where they learn to be citizens or where they learn to collaborate. I was asking myself, like, where are they supposed to learn to collaborate or to do things together? And there's a question from Adisa there now. Could you elaborate about religion? Are these people less religious? Don't they go to church and use it as a social support network?
So no. So one of the things that has happened is that people who do not have college degrees in the US over the last several decades have kind of seen a huge decrease in religious engagement. So they might be spiritual, but they don't actually go to church. And the area I was studying in used to have 12 or 13 churches, and it was consolidated down into 2. And it was also, there's a lot of corruption with, child sexual abuse as well. So there'd been kind of a giving up on, I think, on the church. So people might be spiritual, but they're not going to church, and they often see the church itself as corrupt. And so I didn't see a whole lot of that. Maybe like an AA, like Alcoholics Anonymous, talking about spirituality, but not like the traditional kind of church on the corner that your family went to, for sure.
Wow. So lonely.
Yeah, can I add to that something? I was starting to think about your research site. It was mainly rural communities, right? And you said something interesting about Black and Hispanic people moving there from the city because they want a better life in the country and they don't want to live in poor neighborhoods with gang activity. But in a way, they lost their community. Maybe, I don't know. They lost their community. Maybe if you go back to Mario Small, his research was mostly in urban communities. and they go to these rural communities, and I think we lost Jennifer again.
No,
she's around.
She's here, but yeah.
Here she is.
I'm actually on my work network now.
Okay.
Oh, okay, congratulations.
So, thank you. Like my internet networks.
Great.
But, so yeah.
Just in time.
You can show us your slides now.
No, it's so sad. I was like, yeah, they're very pretty. They have all this art, and there's like all the list of what the art is. Forget it. It's all over. So, but yeah, I'm sorry. Can we go? Let's go back to this point of the racial kind of diversity, or
and the rural versus urban communities. Because I mean, perhaps it would be better off for them to have stayed in these poor neighborhoods, but they had very tight links there.
Yeah, that's interesting, because a lot of them thought of it as, and this is like an interesting trend. I think it's happening like across the US, where rural areas are becoming more racially diverse. So there's a lot of flux, but yeah, I think many of them saw it as like their way to start over and start fresh, and like leave behind like having been a prostitute or having sold drugs, and, you know, saying, I'm going to go and start a new life for my family. But at the same time, yeah, they're probably losing access to family members, but they kind of like framed it that way, like that's why they were going. So yeah, and they probably like also lost knowledge about how to maybe navigate systems, but still most people seemed still happy they had left where they were from. It's an interesting area. Like you could rent a whole house for like $300, so it's like kind of allows you to like actually survive. And I think that was part of it too.
Interesting.
I know the pandemic, at least in England, it had a big impact on people wanting to have more space. People that lived in very dense, very small places, and the pandemic pushed a lot of people to places where that are cheaper and where they have more space, more living space, because now, you know, that thought that you can never know what will happen again, and that need to, you know, I don't know, to breathe.
Yeah. Or even to be able to, it would be really interesting because a lot of the houses in the area are they're like duplexes, but they're double sided. And one side would be like a, you know, Trump digs coal, we love Trump. And the other side would be like a newcomer family from the city who was maybe like Puerto Rican or Black. And it was like side by side, but at the same time, they were still happy, I think, they still, the newcomers, would say, well, at least I can go on my front porch and not worry about getting like killed. Versus like the white people would think, oh, this is a sign that our town is just falling apart and there's no hope.
Okay, I think we reached the point in which we can sum up. Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was a fascinating talk. It was an amazing introduction to American poverty. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that from the beginning. I thank you for introducing us to these dynamics of hope and hopelessness and the tension between the two. And I do hope that we as people who live in more privileged circumstances find ways to study and convey the message that alternative politics, alternative social policy is an urgent transformation for all of us in the US and in Israel. I recently read an important book by Fiona Williams about critical social policy and how we should all become a part of this movement of developing ideas into critical social policy so that social policy makers can hear us and become sensitive to all forms of oppression and their intersections. And I do hope that we can maintain hope in order to maintain activism and promote some change, either as public sociologists or otherwise activists in civil society and otherwise. Thank you so much. I wish you good luck with your new book, and I hope it draws much attention. And I'm sure that many of the people who attended this evening talk would be interested in approaching you in the future. I'm sure there some important collaboration can come up of this.
I'd love that. Yeah, I'm sorry I was bouncing in and out of the Zoom room the whole time.
Next time we organize a meeting, you stay at home with the reliable.
Stay at home, I won't come to work. I know. Please enjoy my slides. Share them, whatever. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming tonight. Please stay in touch with the family research community and the youth studies research communities. We'll have many more interesting